Some moments in life arrive like lightning strikes, splitting time into before and after. For Margaret Williams, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday morning when she least expected it. She had been living with unbearable grief for 3 years, carrying the weight of loss that had slowly crushed her spirit. The official reports, the closed case files, the sympathy cards that had long stopped coming. Everything told her the same devastating truth. Her son was gone forever. But truth, as Margaret was about to discover, sometimes wears many faces. And sometimes, the most profound revelations come from the most unexpected sources. What happened next would not only shatter everything she believed about her son's fate, but would also expose a web of secrets so deep and dark that it would change multiple lives forever. This is the story of how one whispered sentence from a 7-year-old girl became the key that unlocked a mystery 3 years in the making, and how the pursuit of that truth while the rain drummed against the windows of Mercy General Hospital with a persistence that matched Margaret Williams's determination to avoid the world outside. She had been working the night shift in the pediatric wing for 8 months now, finding solace in the quiet corridors and the gentle breathing of sleeping children. It was better than going home to an empty house where every corner held memories of her son David. David had been 16 when he disappeared. One moment he was walking to school on what seemed like any other morning, backpack slung over his shoulder, promising to be home for dinner. The next moment, he was gone, as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. The police investigation had lasted for months, involving search teams, volunteers, and even the FBI. They had found his backpack near the old railway bridge on the outskirts of town, along with what appeared to be evidence of a struggle. The conclusion was inevitable and devastating. David Williams was presumed dead, another victim of the violence that sometimes claimed young lives in their struggling neighborhood. Margaret had fought that conclusion with everything she had. She had organized search parties long after the official ones had ended. She had plastered his picture on every telephone pole, storefront, and bulletin board within a 50-mile radius. She had chased down every lead, no matter how far-fetched, and followed up on every supposed sighting, no matter how unlikely. But as months turned into years, even her closest friends began to suggest, gently but persistently, that it was time to accept the truth and begin the process of healing. The truth was a sharp-edged thing that cut her every time she tried to hold it. The truth was that her husband Robert had left her 6 months after David's disappearance, unable to cope with her refusal to move on. The truth was that her daughter Sarah, now 23 and living across the country, rarely called anymore, because every conversation inevitably circled back to David. The truth was that Margaret had lost not just her son, but her entire family, her social connections, and, most days, her will to continue. Working at the hospital had become her lifeline. The needs of sick children provided a focus for her maternal instincts that had nowhere else to go. She could channel her protective energy into making sure 7-year-old Tommy got his medications on time, or that little Maria had someone to read to her during the long nights when pain kept her awake. The other nurses had learned not to ask too many personal questions. They knew she was carrying some kind of loss. It was written in the careful way she held herself, in the extra gentleness she showed the children, in the way she volunteered for every holiday shift so that nurses with families could go home. On this particular Tuesday morning, Margaret was finishing up her rounds when she encountered a new patient who would change everything. The little girl had been admitted the night before with pneumonia, and, according to her chart, she was 7 years old with the name Keisha Johnson. She was small for her age, with dark skin and enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold far too much knowledge for someone so young. Her grandmother, who had brought her in, was an elderly woman named Mrs. Johnson who spoke in whispers and kept glancing nervously toward the door. What struck Margaret immediately was not just the child's obvious illness, but something else, a wariness that seemed unusual even for a sick child in an unfamiliar place. Keisha watched every movement of the medical staff with an intensity that suggested she was accustomed to being vigilant, to reading situations for potential danger. When Margaret approached her bed to check her the little girl's eyes followed her every movement with an alertness that was both touching and concerning. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, adjusting the blanket around the small form. Her voice carried the gentle warmth that had made her a favorite among the pediatric patients over the years. Keisha studied her for a long moment before answering. "Better," she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "The breathing doesn't hurt as much." Margaret checked the monitors and made notes on the chart. The child's condition was improving, but she would need to stay at least another day or two. As Margaret worked, she became aware that Keisha was still watching her intently, as if trying to make some kind of decision. "Nurse Margaret," the little girl said suddenly, reading the name tag pinned to Margaret Scrubs. "That's a pretty name." "Thank you, honey. Is there anything I can get for you? Are you comfortable?" Keisha was quiet for so long that Margaret thought she had fallen asleep. But when she looked down, the child's eyes were wide open, staring at her with an expression that seemed far too serious for her age. "I know you," Keisha said finally. Margaret smiled. "Well, I'm taking care of you now, so I guess you do know me." "No." Keisha shook her head slowly. "I know you from before. I seen your picture." A chill ran down Margaret's spine, though she couldn't have said why. "My picture? Where did you see my picture, sweetie?" The little girl glanced toward the door, checking to make sure they were alone. Her grandmother had gone downstairs to the cafeteria, and the hallway was temporarily empty. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The boy showed it to me. The boy with the sad eyes. He keeps your picture in his pocket." Margaret's heart began to pound so hard she could hear it in her ears. "What boy, Keisha? What boy has my picture?" "The one who lives in the basement with Uncle Marcus. The one who's not supposed to be there." Keisha's eyes darted to the door again, fear now clearly visible in her expression. "Uncle Marcus said never to talk about the boy, but I think the boy is sad because he misses his mama." The room seemed to tilt around Margaret. She gripped the rail of the hospital bed to steady herself, her knuckles white with the force of her hold. "Keisha, I need you to tell me more about this boy. Can you describe him to me?" The little girl nodded slowly. "He's not little like me. He's big, but not grown-up big. And he has curly hair that's dark brown. And he's got a scar right here." She touched a spot above her left eyebrow. "And his eyes are green, but they look sad all the time." The description hit Margaret like a physical blow. David had gotten that scar when he was 12, falling off his bicycle and striking his head on the pavement. It had required 6 stitches and had left a small but permanent mark above his left eyebrow. And his eyes were indeed green, inherited from Margaret's own father. "Keisha," Margaret said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. "Where is this basement? Where does Uncle Marcus live?" Fear flickered across the child's face. "I'm not supposed to tell. Uncle Marcus gets really mad when people ask questions. He says bad things happen to people who can't keep secrets." Margaret knelt down beside the bed so that she was at eye level with the little girl. Every instinct as both a nurse and a mother told her to be gentle, not to frighten this child who was clearly already scared. But every fiber of her being was screaming that this might be the breakthrough she had been praying for through 3 years of endless nights. "Keisha, I think the boy you're talking about might be my son. He's been missing for a very long time, and I've been looking for him. If there's any chance he's out there, I need to know where he is." The little girl's eyes filled with tears. "He told me his name was David. He said his mama probably thinks he's dead, but he's not dead. He's just stuck." Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet. She had to grip the bed rail even tighter to keep from falling. For 3 years, she had been told to accept that David was gone. For 3 years, well-meaning people had encouraged her to grieve and move on. But here was this little girl, this stranger, telling her what her heart had never stopped believing, that her son was still alive. "Keisha, this is very important. I need you to tell me everything you can remember about where you saw David. Can you do that for me?" The little girl nodded, though tears were now streaming down her face. "Uncle Marcus lives in the house with the blue shutters on Elm Street. But it's not really Uncle Marcus's house. He just stays there sometimes when Grandma can't watch me. And there's a door in the kitchen that goes down to the basement. But Uncle Marcus always keeps it locked. He says there's just old stuff down there, but sometimes I hear voices." Margaret's mind was racing. Elm Street was only about 15 minutes from the hospital, in a part of town she knew well. She had probably driven past that house with the blue shutters dozens of times during her own desperate searches in the months after David's disappearance. "How long has the boy been in the basement, Keisha?" "A long time. Since before I started school." Uncle Marcus sometimes brings him food, and sometimes I hear them talking when Uncle Marcus thinks I'm asleep. The boy, David, he always asks about his mama. He always wants to know if anyone's looking for him. Margaret had to bite her lip to keep from sobbing. The thought of David trapped somewhere, wondering if anyone was searching for him, wondering if his family still cared about him, was almost more than she could bear. Did David ever ask you to do anything? Did he ever ask you to tell anyone about him? Keisha nodded eagerly. He said if I ever met a nurse named Margaret Williams at the hospital, I should tell her that her son is still alive. He said you work here sometimes, and that maybe someday I might get sick and have to come here, and maybe I would meet you. The little girl paused, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I didn't think it would really happen, but then I got sick and Grandma brought me here, and there you were. Margaret felt as if she was living in some kind of dream. The odds of this encounter happening seemed impossibly small, and yet here it was unfolding in front of her. But even as hope bloomed in her chest for the first time in 3 years, she was also grappling with the horrifying implications of what Keisha was telling her. If David was alive, it meant that for 3 years, someone had been holding him against his will. It meant that he had been right there, in their own town, probably no more than a few miles from their house, while she had been putting up missing person flyers and organizing search parties. It meant that whoever had taken him had let her and the police and the entire community believe he was dead while keeping him imprisoned. Keisha, I need to ask you something very important, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Is David hurt? Is Uncle Marcus hurting him? The little girl considered this question seriously. I don't think Uncle Marcus hits him or anything. But David always looks hungry, and his clothes are too big for him like he got skinnier. And he always looks scared when Uncle Marcus comes down to the basement. But mostly he just looks sad. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process everything she was hearing. When she opened them again, Keisha was watching her with concern. Are you going to help him? The little girl asked. David talks about you all the time. He says you're the best mama in the world, and that you probably still make his favorite cookies. The mention of the cookies nearly broke Margaret's composure. Margaret's hands trembled as she finished her morning shift, each routine task feeling surreal in light of what she had just learned. She moved through the motions of checking patients, administering medications, and updating charts, but her mind was entirely focused on the house with blue shutters on Elm Street. Every fiber of her being wanted to rush there immediately, to bang down the door and demand to see her son, but 3 years of dealing with law enforcement had taught her that the wrong approach could make everything worse. As soon as her shift ended at 8 in the morning, Margaret drove straight to the police station. The building held painful memories for her. Too many hours spent in waiting rooms, too many conversations with detectives who had gradually shifted from concerned to sympathetic to quietly skeptical of her insistence that David was still alive. But today felt different. Today she had information, not just a mother's intuition. Detective Ray Morrison had been the lead investigator on David's case. A man in his late 40s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much, he had always treated Margaret with respect even when it was clear he believed her son was dead. When the desk sergeant told him that Margaret Williams was there to see him, Morrison felt a familiar weight in his chest. He had hoped that she was finally finding some peace. Margaret, he said as she entered his office. It's good to see you. How are you holding up? Detective Morrison, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Margaret said, sitting down across from his desk. I have new information about David. I know where he is. Morrison's expression shifted to one of careful concern. Over the years, Margaret had brought him numerous tips and leads, most of which had led nowhere. He had learned to respond with patience and thoroughness, knowing that investigating each possibility was sometimes the only way to help parents accept the truth. Tell me what you've learned, he said, taking out a notepad. Margaret recounted everything that Keisha had told her, describing the conversation in detail and emphasizing the specific information that only David would know: the scar, the green eyes, the mention of her name and workplace. As she spoke, she watched Morrison's expression change from polite attention to genuine interest. You said this child mentioned a scar above the left eyebrow? Morrison asked, flipping through the case file he had pulled from his drawer. Yes, the exact spot where David got hurt when he was 12. Morrison found the page he was looking for. David's physical description, including the small scar, was right there in the file. It wasn't information that had been widely publicized during the search efforts. And she said the man's name was Marcus? Uncle Marcus, she called him. She said he lived in a house with blue shutters on Elm Street, but that it wasn't really his house. Morrison was now taking notes rapidly. Margaret, I need to ask you this directly. Is there any possibility that this child could have gotten this information some other way? Could she have heard you talking about David, or seen pictures of him? Margaret had anticipated this question. Detective, I had never seen this little girl before yesterday. I've been working at the hospital for 8 months, and she was a new admission. Her grandmother brought her in from the other side of town. There's no way she could have known about David's scar, and there's no way she could have known that his eyes are green or that I work at that hospital. David had been carrying my picture for 3 years, waiting for someone to find me. Morrison studied the case file for several more minutes, cross-referencing details and timelines. Finally, he looked up at Margaret with an expression she hadn't seen from him in years, hope tempered with caution. Margaret, I'm going to follow up on this. I want you to understand that we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If David is being held against his will, and if this Marcus person realizes that we're investigating, it could put David in danger. What do you need me to do? First, I need you to not go to that house. I know every instinct you have is telling you to rush over there, but you have to let us handle this professionally. Second, I need you to think carefully about whether there's anyone else who might have had access to detailed information about David's disappearance, anyone who might have shared information with this family. Margaret nodded, though the idea of waiting even another hour felt almost unbearable. How long will it take to investigate? I'm going to start by driving by the house, just to see what we're dealing with. Then, I'll run background checks on any Marcus associated with that address. If this pans out, we'll need to involve more specialized units. This isn't just a missing person case anymore. If what this child is telling us is true, we're talking about kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. Morrison's phone rang as they were talking. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned back to Margaret. That was the desk sergeant. He said a woman named Mrs. Johnson called asking to speak with someone about her granddaughter's conversation with a nurse at the hospital. She said she's worried that Keisha might have told someone something she shouldn't have. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. That's Keisha's grandmother, the one who brought her to the hospital. I think we need to talk to Mrs. Johnson as soon as possible. She might have additional information that could help us, or she might be able to tell us more about this Marcus character. An hour later, Mrs. Johnson sat in the same chair where Margaret had been, her weathered hands gripping her purse tightly, and her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was a small woman in her 70s, with silver hair and the kind of careful posture that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. When Morrison gently asked her about Marcus, her entire demeanor became even more guarded. Marcus ain't a bad man, she said slowly. He's my daughter's boyfriend, been around for about 4 years now. When my daughter got herself arrested for drugs, Marcus sometimes helps me watch Keisha when I got to work. Mrs. Johnson, your granddaughter mentioned seeing a teenage boy at Marcus's house. Can you tell me anything about that? Mrs. Johnson was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with something. I always wondered about that house, she finally said. Marcus, he don't have no job that I can see, but somehow he always got money. And sometimes when I drop Keisha off there, I hear sounds from downstairs, like someone walking around. But Marcus always says it's just the old pipes. Have you ever seen this boy yourself? No, but Keisha, she's always been real observant. If she says she's seen someone, she probably did. And lately, she's been asking me questions about why some kids don't get to go home to their mamas. Morrison exchanged a glance with Margaret. Mrs. Johnson, we have reason to believe that the boy Keisha saw might be someone who's been missing for a long time. We're going to need to investigate Marcus's house, and we're going to need your help to make sure Keisha is safe during this process. The elderly woman's eyes widened. You think Marcus took somebody's child? We're not sure yet, but we need to find out. Are you willing to help us? Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. If there's a child being kept from his family, then, yes, I'll help however I can. Morrison spent the next 2 hours coordinating with various departments. He contacted the FBI, since kidnapping across state lines was a federal crime, and he reached out to the SWAT team, since they didn't know what kind of weapons or resistance they might encounter. He also arranged for social services to be on standby, both to help David if they found him and to ensure that Keisha was properly cared for during the investigation. By early afternoon, a plan had been developed. Surveillance teams would monitor the house on Elm Street to establish patterns of movement and determine who was inside. Mrs. Johnson would pick up Keisha from the hospital as planned and take her home, keeping her away from Marcus's house until the situation was resolved. If their surveillance confirmed that there was indeed someone being held in the basement, they would execute a warrant and attempt a rescue. Margaret had been asked to wait at the police station, which felt like a special kind of torture. She paced the hallway, drank terrible coffee from the vending machine, and called in sick for her next shift at the hospital. Every minute felt like an hour, and she found herself constantly checking her phone for updates. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Detective Morrison's phone rang. Margaret watched his face as he took the call, trying to read his expression for any hint of what news he was receiving. "They've confirmed movement in the basement," he told her after hanging up. "Thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures in the lower level of the house, one adult and one that appears to be a teenager or young adult. There's also been minimal movement upstairs, suggesting that Marcus is home. What happens now? Now we execute the warrant. The team is in position, and they're going to move within the hour." Margaret felt her knees go weak. "Can I be there? Can I be nearby when they go in?" Morrison considered this. "You can be in the area, but you'll need to stay well back from the actual operation. If David is in there, he's going to need medical attention, and he's going to need to see a familiar face. But, Margaret, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this isn't David, or that the situation is more complicated than we think." "I understand." But, as Margaret followed Morrison's car toward Elm Street, she wasn't sure she really did understand. She wasn't sure anyone could understand what it felt like to live with hope for 3 years, to have that hope slowly crushed by reality, and then to have it suddenly, impossibly, rekindled. She wasn't sure anyone could understand the fear that was mixing with her hope, the terror that they would be too late, that David would be moved before they got there, that this was all some terrible mistake. The house with blue shutters looked ordinary from the outside. It was a small, 2-story structure that needed paint, with a tiny front yard and a chain-link fence. There was an old sedan in the driveway, and newspapers piled on the front porch, suggesting that no one had been maintaining the property carefully. To Margaret, it looked like the kind of place where families lived paycheck to paycheck, not like the site of a 3-year kidnapping. The SWAT team moved with precision that was both impressive and terrifying. Within seconds, they had surrounded the house, blocked all exits, and announced their presence with loudspeakers. Margaret watched from 2 blocks away, her heart pounding so hard that she could barely breathe. The front door opened, and a man in his 30s emerged. With the police station had never felt so much like a sanctuary and a prison at the same time. Margaret sat in Detective Morrison's office, watching the clock on the wall tick past each second while medical personnel and social workers evaluated her son in another room down the hall. She had been allowed to see David briefly when he first arrived, just long enough to confirm that he was indeed her child and that he wanted to see her. But then, the professionals had taken over. That first glimpse had been everything, and nothing like what Margaret had imagined during her countless sleepless nights over the past 3 years. David had grown taller, probably reaching 6 feet now, but he was painfully thin, as if he hadn't been getting proper nutrition. His dark hair was longer than he had ever worn it, hanging nearly to his shoulders in a way that made him look older than his 19 years. But it was his eyes that had shaken Margaret to her core, still the same green color she remembered, but holding a wariness and depth that no 19-year-old should possess. When he had seen her in the hallway, David's reaction had been immediate and heartbreaking. Tears had started streaming down his face before he had even taken a step toward her, and when she had wrapped her arms around him, she had felt how thin he had become, how he seemed to hold himself as if he was always prepared to defend against some threat. "Mom," he had whispered against her shoulder, his voice deeper than she remembered, but carrying the same inflection that had been etched into her memory. "I knew you'd find me. I knew you wouldn't stop looking." Margaret had wanted to hold on to that moment forever, but the medical team had gently separated them. explaining that David needed immediate evaluation and that there were protocols that had to be followed when someone had been held captive for an extended period. Margaret understood intellectually that this was necessary, but emotionally, being separated from her son again felt like cruelty. Dr. Sarah Chun, the physician who was overseeing David's evaluation, had been kind but professional when she spoke with Margaret. Physically, your son appears to be in relatively good health, considering the circumstances, she had explained. He's undernourished and showing signs of vitamin deficiency, but nothing that can't be addressed with proper care. Psychologically, it's going to be more complex. 3 years of captivity, especially during such crucial developmental years, will have left impacts that we'll need to address carefully. Now, as Margaret waited for the evaluation to be completed, Detective Morrison was briefing her on what they had learned from Marcus during his initial interrogation. The story that was emerging was both more and less complicated than Margaret had imagined. Marcus Coleman is 34 years old, and he has a history of minor drug offenses and theft, Morrison explained, reading from his notes. According to his statement, he never intended to keep David for 3 years. He claims that what happened was essentially an accident that spiraled out of control. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. An accident? Keeping my son prisoner for 3 years was an accident. Let me tell you what he's saying, and then we'll talk about what it means legally, Morrison said carefully. According to Coleman, 3 years ago he was driving through David's neighborhood early in the morning, looking for houses to burglarize. He had been struggling with a drug addiction and was desperate for money. He saw David walking to school and initially just planned to rob him, take his backpack, maybe get a phone or some cash. Margaret's hands clenched into fists as she listened. Coleman says that when he confronted David, your son recognized him. Apparently, Coleman had done some work for a neighbor of yours several months earlier, yard work or something similar, and David had seen him around the neighborhood. David called him by name. So he kidnapped David because David could identify him? That's what Coleman claims. He says he panicked, forced David into his car, and drove to the house on Elm Street, which belongs to his uncle who was in prison at the time. Coleman says he only intended to keep David there for a few days, until he could figure out what to do. Margaret could feel her pulse racing as Morrison continued. According to Coleman, the original plan was to release David after the police investigation died down. But, as time went on, he became more and more afraid of the consequences. He knew that kidnapping carried serious prison time, and he convinced himself that if he released David, he would immediately be arrested and sent to prison for years. So instead he decided to keep my son in his basement indefinitely? Coleman claims that he kept thinking he would figure out a way to safely release David, but the longer it went on, the more impossible it seemed. He says he never physically abused David, that he provided food and basic necessities, and that he even tried to make the basement living space as comfortable as possible. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Detective Morrison, I don't care what this man's justifications are. He stole 3 years of my son's life. He stole 3 years of my life. He destroyed my marriage and my family, and he let me believe my child was dead. Margaret, I understand your anger, and I want you to know that Coleman is going to face serious charges. Kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment. He's looking at decades in prison. But I wanted you to understand what David has been through, because it's going to help you understand his psychological state. Morrison paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. According to Coleman, over the 3 years, he and David developed what Coleman describes as a relationship. Not a healthy one, obviously, but Coleman claims that David sometimes talked to him about his fears, his memories of home, his hopes for the future. Coleman even admits that David asked repeatedly to be allowed to contact you, and that David often talked about how much he missed his family. Why are you telling me this? Because David is going to need help processing what he's been through. For 3 years, this man was essentially the only human contact your son had. Even though Coleman was his captor, David may have complex feelings about their relationship. It's something called Stockholm Syndrome, and it's not uncommon in long-term captivity situations. Before Margaret could respond, Dr. Chin appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Williams, your son is asking to see you now. Margaret followed Dr. Chin down the hallway to a small consultation room where David was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the parking lot. He had been given clean clothes, a simple t-shirt, and jeans that were still too big for his thin frame, and someone had cut his hair to a more manageable length. He looked up when Margaret entered, and she could see that he had been crying. "Mom," he said, standing up quickly. "They said I can come home with you." Margaret moved across the room and hugged him again, this time holding on longer and feeling him relax against her. "David, I have missed you every single day for 3 years. There has not been one moment when I stopped believing you were alive, not one moment when I stopped looking for you." David pulled back to look at her face. "I know. Marcus told me that you were still putting up flyers, that you never gave up. He showed me a newspaper, his hands raised." Even from a distance, Margaret could see that he was thin and nervous looking, with the kind of jumpy energy that suggested he was accustomed to watching over his shoulder. This had to be Marcus, but it was what happened next that made Margaret's world stop spinning. The basement door opened, and a figure emerged who was taller than she remembered, thinner than he had been, but unmistakably her son. David Williams stepped into the sunlight for the first time in 3 years, blinking and shading his eyes, his green eyes scanning the crowd of police officers with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. Even from 2 blocks away, even after 3 years of change and growth, Margaret knew her son. She knew the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. She knew the way his dark hair curled at the base of his neck. She knew the scar above his left eyebrow. And she knew those green eyes that were now searching the crowd as if looking for something or someone specific. Detective Morrison was speaking into his radio, but Margaret couldn't hear the words over the rushing sound in her ears. After 3 years of being told to give up hope, after 3 years of being told that David was almost certainly dead, her son was walking toward the police cars under his own power. David was alive. David was coming home. But even as overwhelming relief flooded through her system, Margaret could see that this was only the beginning of a much longer and more complicated story. Her son had been kept in a basement for 3 years. Someone had stolen 3 years of his life, 3 years of her life, 3 years of their family's life. And now they were going to have to figure out how to put the pieces back together. As the police cars began moving away from the scene, transporting both Marcus and David to the station for questioning and medical evaluation, Margaret followed at a distance. She was going to see her son today. She was going to hold him and tell him that she had never stopped looking for him, never stopped believing he was alive. But she also knew that this was not going to be the happy ending she had dreamed about during all those sleepless nights. This was going to be the beginning of a new and different kind of challenge, one that would test everything she thought she knew about justice, forgiveness, and what it meant to be a family. Completely. David's favorite cookies had been chocolate chip with extra vanilla, and she had indeed made them every Sunday for as long as he had lived at home. After his disappearance, she had continued making them for months, putting them in the freezer as if he might come home any day and want them fresh and warm. "Yes," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'm going to help him. But, Keisha, I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise that you won't tell Uncle Marcus that you talked to me about this. Can you promise me that?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "I promise. But you have to promise me something too." "What's that, sweetheart?" "You have to promise that you'll get David out of there. He's been waiting so long for someone to find him." Margaret took the little girl's small hand in both of hers. "I promise you, Keisha. I'm going to bring my son home." As Margaret left Keisha's room to continue her rounds, her mind was already racing ahead to what she needed to do next. She had to contact the police, but she was also terrified that any delay might give this Marcus person a chance to move David or hurt him. She had to be strategic, careful, and fast. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret Williams had hope. But she also had something else that was perhaps even more powerful. She had a mother's fury at the thought of someone keeping her child from her for so long. And that fury was going to fuel her determination to bring David home, no matter what it took. LD lead Margaret down a path she never imagined she would have to walk.